Hello, everyone. Welcome to another book review Wednesday, and today I'm going to be briefly discussing the book A Tale of Two Cities by none other than Charles Dickinson. Uh, or Dickens, excuse me. So basically, this is probably one of the most famous of the Charles Dickens books out there. Especially with its opening lines. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and it goes on from something from there, but it's pretty lengthy. But regardless of its length, it still provides a lot of interesting ideas and concepts that were sort of relevant to the time, as well as create a rather interesting and elaborate story to go along with it. Now, this one I've actually been holding off to review for quite some time because it's sort of hard to explain the plot without really spoiling anything. So I think the best way I can explain this plot is that technically, I guess you could say, main character of the story, Charles Darnier, is first accused of being a French as well as uh, a United States spy or an American spy uh, in England, and eventually he is excused from being accused of that. And eventually you'll see how he ends up back in France, his home, really, technically. And how he's sort of really distant from his family because, again, it's emphasized that Charles Darnier came from a fairly well-off family and doesn't really want to be associated with them. Hence why he stayed in England, I guess, for some time before really returning to France, because ultimately what drives him to return to France is apparently a servant of his is being captured by these revolutionaries. Now, what we need to understand about this book in particular is that it does take place around the French Revolution, when all of the really wealthy people within France were sort of being accused of wrongdoing and injustices to those of the lower classes. And it's sort of emphasized that Charles Darnier's family is supposed to be one of those upper echelons of French society, even though he doesn't really want to be involved with them, really. But he does go back because of his servant, and you'll see how he eventually gets captured and put on trial again, and how that eventually, sort of unfolds, because again, there's also a lot of other characters that are sort of involved. And if I explain more in depth as to who they are and everything, I think it would be really spoiling it for everyone. So all you really need to know is that the ultimate driving conflict of this story primarily is Charles Darnay being accused of crimes. Which is really strange because he's just this innocent guy who didn't really do anything. So, but I think what's more interesting about this book, which you will see partially the character interactions, in particular what one character does for another, which I think is a very noble thing to do, and I think largely was a driving force for Charles Dickens, at least to write the book in this way. And also, I think what's really important to understand as far as where Dickens is sort of coming from the perspective of the French Revolution, is that he kind of doesn't really look upon it as something as really noble, because a lot of what ended up happening within the revolution sort of resulted in a lot of chaos and a lot of bloodshed, and just a lot of eventual sort of problems that you'll obviously see if you read French history later on that the revolutions really didn't do much because they ended up just replacing it with a dictator, at least from what I can tell. I believe I'm not sure if Napoleon was the first one to be technically a leader replacement. I think there were some other people probably before him, but he was one of the major ones. So again, it just goes to show that this is a time of disarray, and I think Charles Dickens wanted to show everyone that obviously there's an understanding to why the revolution took place, and I think he does emphasize this in particular with one event that occurs within the book that involves a little I think it's a boy that gets run over by a carriage by this guy who's sort of this rich upper class guy, and hence people get pissed off. So I think he is trying to he understands from the perspective of those who are of the lower class and feel like that they don't have any means to really survive and thrive within French society. But then he also kind of shows, too, how this revolution, even though it is unavoidable in for certain reasons, it still, again, doesn't really end up producing anything that much better, and ends up creating a lot more chaos and problems. And I think that's largely, primarily through when you can see through Charles Donnier's character when he's being accused of all of these different things that he's never really, been really responsible for. And all of the revolutionaries are kind of in sort of a disarray, and they're just, arresting people, and they're and there's a lot of bloodshed going on. It just shows you the amount of, it was just chaos. It was just very disorienting chaos that was going on during this period, as a result of all of these people who were of the lower class feeling like that they were being treated poorly and not given a whole lot of opportunity. So again, also I think it also brings up an interesting concept too of, you sort of become what ultimately you hate, which is I think what happens oftentimes within a lot of these revolutions throughout history is that even though they might have started out with good intentions, they end up getting completely botched over just the fact that they end up being so chaotic and so disorienting and unorganized and incapable of really producing any real positive change, really. Because again, people, the revolutions kind of, again, it just leads into something else, but doesn't really solve the whole problems that were existent at least around that time period. So again, it just goes to show that I think Dickens did have a very interesting perspective from it, and I can definitely understand his viewpoint as far as the criticism of the revolution, the French Revolution, as well as the reasons into why in which it was really even started in the first place. So I think that's something that's very important to note. And also I think, even if in these times of chaos and sort of, and disarray, there still can be moments of where people, go out of their way to do something for others. And Dickens really does try to show it with, in particular, a sacrifice of one particular character that you will see within the end of the book. And I really do not want to spoil this for anybody because I think it's really important, and it's again, it's so hard for me to explain this plot without really spoiling it. So again, that's it, but it relates to Charles Darnay's character. So so again, something that's very important. But I think regardless of what you can take away from this particular story, I think overall, what makes this book, I think, so profound, at least around the time that it did come out, was the fact that I think Charles Dickens probably wasn't alone into his way of thinking in regards to the French Revolution. I'm sure there were other people who sort of shared his viewpoints and also kind of saw uh, things that were sort of reflective onto the things that were going on within the French Revolution that did exist within the book. Um, Again, not saying that any of these characters or any of the plots existed, but again, the kinds of circumstances of, the chaos and the violence was just something that was very, very rampant. So again, something that's, I think, very important to note. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say about A Tale of Two Cities without really giving anything away, because again, like I said before, really talking about the plot just reveals it, unfortunately. And that's why I kind of felt like I had to put this off, because I'm like, how do I really explain this without really spoiling it? But again, very interesting insights that I think that can be found from this book. So it's definitely, I think, a worthy recommendation if you're interested in that sort of a thing. And if in particular you like the French Revolution, I think this is definitely a good book to pick up, even though it's not reflective onto anything that actually happened. It still, gets you into the mindset of what certain people were thinking, at least around that time period. But I think that's ultimately all I can say. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.